A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Myanmar Devi, Research Scholar, Department of Biotechnology, and your host for today's function. Once again, I would like to extend a warm welcome to each one of you present out here on this 2-day national seminar on the theme Security, Trade and Development, Reimagining Indo-Myanmar Trade Amidst Regional Conflicts, organized by Department of Southeast Asian Studies, Manipur University, in collaboration with College Development Council, NU, Manipur College, Kaksin, and Angomcha Temple College, Yangtang. Ladies and gentlemen, as all of us aware of the fact that organizing this seminar is essential to bring together experts, policymakers, and stakeholders to examine the complex relationship between security challenges, trade disruptions, and development opportunities in the Indo-Myanmar region. It provides a platform to analyze how regional conflicts, especially in Manipur, affect cross-border connectivity and economic growth, while fostering dialogue to develop sustainable strategies for peace, stability, and regional integration. Before we start our program, I would like to take the opportunity to introduce the dignitaries of today's function. Dr. Angomcha Bimol Akoijam, Honorable MP of Inner Manipur Lok Sabha, will take a seat as chief guest. Professor N. Lokyendro Singha, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Manipur University, will take a seat as President, and Professor Memcha Loitokwan, in School of Social Sciences, Manipur University, and Professor Singlen Maisnam, HOD, Department of Southeast Asian Studies, Manipur University, will be our guest of honors. Now the time has come to add some dignities and presence to the dais, as the dignitaries have already arrived in the hall. Professor Singlen Maisnam and Professor Piroranjan to come up on the stage.
Good morning to everyone, and our Vice Chancellor, Mr. Lokyendro, Mr. Priyaranjan, Mr. Singlen Maisnam, Mr. Memcha, and other teachers and scholars in this hall. First of all, I would like to thank the Department of East Asian Studies, Manipur University, for giving me this opportunity. I'm not an economic expert, but generally as a student of social science, and what I consider myself as a passionate denizen who always try to read something or think about issues that implicate my home state. I have certain issues that I would like to flag, which I can see the papers, some of the issues will be taken care of. But how to organize our thought as I sense, I would organize my thought in terms of 4 issues. The first is that when we think through this topic, security, trade and development, reimagining Indo-Myanmar trade amidst regional conflict, it's very crucial for us to set up the text as well as the context of the issues that we deal with it. You know, I have always said to my students as well as my way of thinking, you know, there is a critical relationship between the text and the context. And my favorite example, which I keep on giving to my research scholar, is that if you wanted to analyze the movement of I in a Kathakali performance as a text of analysis, it is something that you try to understand the expression of the emotions through the expression in the eye. You need to understand the face, the mask, the get-up that the performer wears. If you remove all these things through a computer image, and if you only leave the eye, the text of your analysis, you won't be able to understand its expression in its full form. It's only when you position your face and the mask and the performing costume of the performer, then you understand the text, which is the expression of the eye, far more better. So if we wanted to discuss about today's issues called security, trade and development, as a three key concept of thinking through the relationship between Indo-Myanmar relationship. This is all research scholars are here and professors are here. We are quite familiar. This is a peculiar way we as a tribe, academics do. We have three key concepts here: security, trade and development. And these are the operative concepts to understand Indo-Myanmar relationship in terms of trade and conflict. This is something that people call it, economists and foreign relation experts often use the term called geostrategic calculation in economic policies. That is to leverage your geography, your political aim and military strategies. Through that lens, you try to position your economic thinking. It is this geostrategic calculation that we need to understand, or what this seminar is looking for. Is essentially, what are these geostrategic calculations are involved in looking at this relationship between India and Myanmar. So as I said, given this, I'd like to organize in terms of 4 specific ideas to think through these issues. The first one is, who is thinking through this process? Because that location, as we call it in social science, is very important. Who's thinking through these issues of Indo-Myanmar trade amidst regional conflicts? If an American is thinking through this, or a Chinese is thinking through this, or an Indian is thinking through this, or a Japanese is thinking through this, they are bound to have different ways of looking at the same issue. So I think, like all social science students, we need to understand who is thinking through this process, and I would like to look at it first in terms of my own home state, because this is happening in Manipur University. So when you leverage geography, politics, and military and so on, and through that lens you try to look at economy and development, it's important to understand a brief sketch of what is geography tells you, what politics tells you, what strategic experiences tells you as a Manipuri when we look through this. For this, we need to have a historical sense of a shift. I may be wrong, but this is a general sense that my reading in history of the place and the region tells me. The little that I understand about these issues, I think that there has been a critical shift in the 19th century in our relationship with Myanmar, which even transformed the geographical conditionalities that have determined our relationship with our neighbor in the east. So let's look at geography first, because economy as conditioned or occasioned by your geographical factors is very crucial in this way. then you need to understand what the geography tells you about our relationship with our eastern neighbor. When I look at the geographical factors, we know right from the geological theories till the historical period, we know that we are part of a mountainous fall created some 50 million years ago to the collision of the Indian plate with the Euro-Asia plate and the creation of the Himalayan fold. And the part of the eastern fold is what today we call it Yauma Aranka range, or sometimes people refer to as the Purvanchal or the Eastern Himalayan fold. We are part of that, geographically speaking. So see from the Kashmir, if you see that particular fold goes like this. From Arunachal, it goes southwards through Nagaland, Manipur, Mizoram, and it goes all the way to Arakan. Then even within the sea you see this fold, and some of them pops up as islands in Andamans and Nicobar Islands. That's a kind of a formation. That geography determines our orientation, our cultural orientation, our national character, and our economic aspirations, and our engagement with the others. That we are a mountainous people. We live in a mountainous region. And these particular four, Yauma Arakan range or the Eastern Himalayas, effectively become sort of a boundary between, geographically speaking, not in a cultural sense, between what the geographers today call it Southeast Asia and South Asia. Among the scholars, there have been debate whether the distinction between Southeast Asia and South Asia is merely geographical and political, or is it more deeper than that in terms of civilizational and cultural distinction is there? A lot of scholars, many of the mainstream scholars, well-known Indian scholars, tend to argue that this is a mere geographical and a political map. But my argument has been, which I have written first time, I think in 2005, this distinction is not merely geographical. There is a civilizational, cultural correlates that distinguish these two. One of the hint to that distinction is when we have this look is policy. Now look at policy. How does the Indian leaders think about Northeast? How does our practices of intellectual craft like historiography or economic planning look at Northeast? You will see here, and I think one of the propounders who have articulated this very clearly was the then donor minister, Mr. Manishankar Iyer, who said India's southeast begins from India's northeast. It is to say it's not a geographical imagination. I have tried to use these expressions by the then donor ministry, and some other authors have used it, including my former colleague in CSDS, Yogendra Yadav, have also used it in one of his writings. So there is a peculiar way in which the Northeast is understood in terms of cultural and civilizational category. And that is what they meant when they say Southeast Asia begins from India's Northeast. This is culturally, they are clubbing it together with Southeast Asia. So that's the Northeast for you in terms of a general marker where we are located. So it is this Northeast which is thinking through this issue of Indo-Myanmar relations in this whole primarily. It's not a Tamil, it's not a Maharashtrian, it is not a Punjabi or a Delhiite who is thinking through this relationship between India and Myanmar. So we need to know what is the location. So how we are located and how we are related with Southeast Asia is this civilizational, cultural way of looking at it. I'm not going to go in, that's why I repeatedly use both the expression civilizational and cultural. Some people tend to distinguish these two terms, just as we try to distinguish the category of culture from religion. But if you look at the problematics of these conceptions like culture, religion, and civilizations, they acquire a specific meaning today. But historically speaking, if you look at it in the works of, say, for example, scholars in the 19th century, anthropologists, and so on, you will see that they are used interchangeably, especially in German tradition. Kultur would still mean what we mean today as civilization. So what I'm saying is that when you read these categories, there are distinctions between these categories, and that is why, if you're wondering why I am repeatedly using these two terms as if they are interchangeable. So I said we are marked civilizationally and culturally in that sense differently, and in that sense we are part of Southeast Asia. Geographically, we are at the cusp of these regions, and this particular mountainous fold on which we live becomes sort of a border marker between these two regions. And because of our location in this, we have a peculiar way of looking at things, peculiar experiences contingent upon this location. And many of the papers is going to look at that, but not very consciously. But you need to understand this particular location very consciously and understand ourselves. Now, within this fold, when I study a little deeper, if we look at this geography, then what I discover is astounding in one sense for Manipur. The life form that developed in this mountainous fold took different trajectories, and Manipur's specific evolution is also determined by its geographical character. So you have, historically, to cut a long story short, you see all the water, main water formation which sustained life and civilization. We have two broad river systems. One is the Barak system, one is the Manipur river system. All these river systems, if you look at it, what you discover is that all of these major rivers run from north to south or northwest to southeast. This feature within the mountainous fold marks today's Manipur different from Nagaland and its southern neighbor, Mizoram. How? All the life forms that develop in Nagaland and their historical trajectory and political experiences are also shaped by their geography. So what happened is in Nagaland, you see all their major rivers flows from southeast to northwest. Unlike ours, northwest to southeast is the opposite. Similarly, in Mizoram, you will see the same thing. All the major rivers from the southeast to the northwest. That is why you will see in political history, Lusai Hill's contact with the Barak Valley has been a very critical component of their history, including their encounter with the British. Similarly, in Nagaland political history, they encounter with the Ahoms, and then followed by British, which made them become part of a deputy commissioner's province in the 20th century, is determined by this geographical character. They have been in touch with the plains on their northwest, both the areas. And in terms of hill ranges, again, if you look a little carefully, what you discover is that the ranges, mountain ranges, or the hill ranges in Manipur, relatively, it is the western side which is higher than our eastern side. And this feature is opposite in Nagaland and Mizoram. The hill ranges in these two, the highest range is on southeast side. So in a way, Manipur is tilted towards Southeast Asia geographically more than Mizoram and Nagaland. And that is why in history, if we look at the movement and the interaction between people, you will see a much more active involvement of Manipur with the Myanmar than these two reasons. In fact, if you look at the economic history, the indications, you will see the movement of labor and capital, two very important aspects of economic transactions across the globe. Movement of labor and capital had already happened more primarily vis-a-vis with the Myanmar for us. Examples, you see these Brahmins and craftsmen, military personals who were there in Myanmar's history, taking very prominent role, are all from Manipur. You will see this. So this movement of capital and labor, which is happening everywhere. You see, for example, the trade of slaves, tea plantations, workers from India, rubber plantations, railway workers that the Americans have used from, say, Philippines and Japan and China, who were made to settle down in the United States as the US expands towards its western coast. The blacks, they have done. So you see this movement of labor has been happening across the globe. Capital, you know, the extractive economy of the colonial period. So there are examples of this movement of goods and capitals and labor. For us, if you look historically, if you try to look at, you get a glimpses of this, that there has been a transaction between Manipur and Myanmar in terms of this movement of labor and capital. This particular aspect, I believe, that took a turn in 19th century. If we calculate it, especially with the consolidation of this shift took place with the first Anglo-Burmese war, in which we got implicated. We were trying to free ourselves with the help of the British, and we took this opportunity of the first Anglo-Burmese war to liberate ourselves. You know the story of Manipur Levy and Gambhir Singh's exploit. It was supposed to be a joint venture with the British, but the British withdrew it after training them. The only officers who actually asked the company to send himself to accompany Gambhir Singh was Pemberton. From that moment onwards, you will see that our economic activity of movement, labor, transactions is increasingly sucked into the South Asian dynamics rather than Southeast Asia. So what I'm saying is that if you look in terms of geostrategic thinking historically, 19th century was the shift where our transaction with the western part of our border increased manifold. And till today, we are all looking to Delhi. Psychologically, we say, Delhi kya kahenge, what the Delhi is going to do, Delhi must do this, they should fund. So we are all oriented towards this. So when we are thinking this location, what Manipuri's relationship with the Indo-Myanmar, historically this last canvas of the shift of the 19th century and how it continues increasingly, how we became a part of the South Asia. So when they think about look is policy, for us, we are thinking about another way of regenerating, realigning ourselves with a historically rooted experience of our relationship with them. It's the neighbor. So that's a kind of a thinking that we must have it. I'll come back to this mind shape, how it affects us, and what is that we need to think more critically in which I'll talk as my fourth issue. So the first issue is this, understanding this historical locations of us and our relationship with the Indo-Myanmar. So when we think reimagining as a Manipuri, as a Northeasterners, how we would be looking at it. Why I am locating this is, very important. When a Maharashtrian thinks, when a Punjabi thinks, or the economic planning with the Myanmar is bound to have a very different way of looking at it, given our locations, and we must not go off their way of looking as your own. And obviously it's a known, location is a very critical category in social science, because they say in feminist theory, all the categories are rooted in patriarchal ethos and we internalize it. So people say the women started looking even at their own bodies exactly in the way a man would look at it. So we need to recover our own vision. That's why I mentioned the first issue, that when we deliberate on this topic is to constantly explore what our location has to do with the way we understand things. Is it really our own vision? Is it something else? And how do we position ourselves? The second one is what I will call it immediate context. These are the things that I have been using it during the last 30 years or so as an academic professional. I always ask, just as the text and context, when you think about the context, you can also think about something called immediate context and a broader context. The context can be differentiated. If I can go back to the example I gave you, the eye and the face relationship is an immediate context, and the costumes and the performance is the broader context within which this meaning is generated. So the immediate context is the relationship between India and Myanmar, mediated by China. It's a triangular way of, we cannot understand in the immediate context when you look at Indo-Myanmar relationship, the immediate context must be formed in terms of dynamics in three ways. It's a triarchic model you should position as. That's what I believe in. One is India, China, and Myanmar. We cannot think about India and Myanmar alone, because anybody who has been following these dynamics, you will know, when India thinks about look is, in their scheme of things, China is not part of that economic imagination. It is the economy of the Southeast. That's what they would say. And that is one of the criticism against the look-is policy or act-is policy. Since you have excluded China from your scheme of things, what is the way we're going to get benefit? Southeast Asia economy is not the only way, because there is a critical link between Southeast economy, including in terms of geostrategic calculation. So whenever we think about relationship with the Indo-Myanmar relationship, it should not be a binary sort of a framing. We should have a triarchic model: China, Myanmar, India. This is a triarchic model that we need to know. If you look at it, you will see a couple of issues. I know the economists and who have done on this will have much more detailed understanding of this one. Mine is a general understanding as I read it. We have this 1970 bilateral trade between India and Myanmar, how it gets evolved over the years. Our investment in infrastructure, for instance, in Myanmar, and oil and gas, if you do a comparative study with the Chinese hold on Myanmar, even on this sector, other is communication infrastructure, especially railways. The Chinese investment in Myanmar. So when you have this three-way relationship, Myanmar's own dynamics, India's own dynamics, we need to understand. For Myanmar, look at is complete, almost like a dependence on China. And this Belt Road initiative of the Chinese, Myanmar is a very, very important component in the Chinese thinking. So you need to understand the geostrategic calculation of China vis-a-vis with Myanmar, the way they have been doing this, and India's investment. We have discovered it very late, as many scholars will remind us. The Chinese have already intruded into Myanmar much more deeply when India recovered. In this dynamics, what I would like to reflect is, in this immediate context, dynamics of the triarchic model. What happened in Manipur in the last 2 years is a part of these geostrategic calculation that we need to understand. My suspicion is, which I have articulated in public speeches, is that India is trying to find what I call a sphere of influence within Myanmar. And that is primarily targeted in Chin State, Arakan, and Saigon Division, of which Chin State becomes the epicenter of that thinking process. Because if you cannot counter China in many other ways, in terms of the intrusion of the Chinese into Myanmar position, what you are trying to do is that you are trying to groom a group of people and sphere where even if it stays within Myanmar, India will have a say vis-a-vis with that group. And to have the southern part, Arakan, Ringu, because this is also a way to counter the BRI of the Chinese, the Belt Road Initiative. And so this conflict that we experience in Manipur, I suspect it's a part of these larger dynamics. And so we are reimagining, we need to know that it is partly this triarchic model will make you aware how we reimagine this relationship. It cannot be purely India-Myanmar looking from Delhi. And we need to find it out, what is this calculation given this triarchic model? And all the other things, Zakatar and More, and look at the economic zone of Chinese and the Myanmar, and the way from the Yunnan side what they have been doing it. You position all their military calculations, the ethnic armies within Myanmar, who is having a hold on these ethnic armies, and with the junta, who has a major say. And almost some people will even hint you in international politics it's perfectly fine for India to play a dual game. India is similarly with the PDF group. At the same time, India is not abandoning its support to the junta. That is the sort of a play that we have it, and then we need to understand whatever you are thinking about Indo-Myanmar, that binary framing will not do. If I can draw a parallel of this triarchic model, allow me to draw a definition of disease by WHO in 1948. When you are looking at disease as this body and the germs of the bacteria, this two-factor model, WHO says that you cannot understand disease with this dimension. You need to have a third dimension, which is environment. And it says that disease is a complex phenomenon produced by interaction among these three factors. The agent, which is the virus or the bacteria, the body, and the environment. So malarial disease, you say, you cannot conceptualize it only with that parasite and the body. You need to have this sanitation. Only when you see your response to that disease will be far more effective. So disease conception was changed in 1948 through this triarchic model from simply looking at body and the other agent. So in a similar sense, what I am saying is that whenever you reflect on Indo-Myanmar, you are trapped in this binary, but forgetting that there is a third dimension. Without that, you cannot fully comprehend your reimagining process. That's the second, which I would call it, immediate context of thinking through this. I'm not going to go into various, I would suggest that we can have a localized studies. I'm not saying that you do this frame. As I say, your analysis can be that movement of the eye. So similarly, you can do the volume of trade transacted in Jakarta and More, for example. Compare with the Chinese transaction in the north, Myanmar. Compare them. This could be fantastic studies to give data from the ground. What kind of this, Ranjan has said about, what was the last item? You said we were 22 to begin with the items. We have expanded. So how much of this is export, how much of this import, and of that, whether those import and export, how does it affect our state's economy? Does it at all affect us, or we are just a transit point. The one fantastic example is a truck passes through Manipur, and some of the sins on the way, it trickles down. The major benefit is the other part of the country. Are we happy with this trickle-down effect in the name of Indo-Myanmar trade? So you need to ask these things, but within the larger framework of the triarchic model as well. The third theme that we can look is broadly the nature of the global economic position. Here, we need to know something is happening, which is, people call it a geometry of global trade, geostrategic calculations. How does it operate? The broader concept is there is a sort of a fragmentation, and trade protectionism seems to have come up in a big way. Earlier, our thinking is that globalization, if you remember, if you trace back World Trade negotiation, GATT negotiation that went on, and around 1980s there was a shift, then we have World Trade Organization. That sense of globalization, 1990s, larger structural changes carried out by many countries such as China, Brazil, South Korea, India, Mexico. That particular shift of the 1990s economic change and the collapse of the Soviet Union, that we were looking at a globalization in some sense through those long negotiations of the GATT and World Trade. That picture has changed or is changing now. That global context of economy is changing. Globalization, you said free trade, and there's this contestation of agriculture's sector's interests, which was a key concern of Japanese and the Koreans on one side, or the France and Germany vis-a-vis with the United States. Those kind of a dynamics. And global economy is rooted in, or trade, for example, as an instrument of cooperation and globalization. That's the thinking that the 1990s till the first decade, last 25 years after 1990, you can count it. Now this last few years, 5 years or so, you can count it roughly 25 to 30 years after that globalization, liberalization, everywhere, perestroika and Soviet Union, India's that's what I said, structural changes that we saw in 1990s. In India, the classic moment we often talk about in terms of Manmohan Singh's budget, the presentation of budget. That picture of global economic structure is changing, and today it is marked by what is called rising geopolitical tensions across Ukrainian conflict, the West Asia problems. Everywhere this tension is happening. And trade protectionism has gone, fragmentation of the economy, and which leads to what some economists call it friend-shoring. They are turning towards who's your friend and multiple trading partners. That's what you are sensing in now, the tension right now when Trump imposes these tariffs on India. It is trying to shake our relationship. India, if you listen to our foreign minister, he will often remind you of this. I am free to enter into any relationship with anybody. That particular way, which is, people call it friends-shoring, friend-short form of economy. That means you are aligning with your friends. If you may have a problem with Russia, but if it is my friend, I do business. I do not go by your global blocks and so on. So these fragmentations in economy and rising geopolitical conflict in the world, the nature of economic relationship globally is changing, especially during the last 5-6 years. So if this is part of the same geopolitical instability that the world sees, that's what you're seeing in Myanmar. It's everywhere. Russian fighters are involved here. You know how the Myanmar regime is, the junta is actually holding on. They said, in some senses, it's not the army, but it's the Air Force, which they have superiority. If you remember Second World War stories, the fate of Britain was hanging on the RAF pilots, they said, for so many years after France was taken over by Germany. UK was relying on its Royal Air Force, and secretly we know how American pilots used to fly those aircrafts, even if they were not in war. So there is an element of these involvement in our just neighbor. It's not a local event. What's happening in Myanmar is not a local event. It's part of a larger instability and rising geo-military tensions across the globe. This affects the way, so the fragmentation of these economic structures. So people are looking more into neighbor and friends, we do. So this multiple way of dealing with things, you can see this statement in many of the interviews by our foreign minister as well. In terms of this, our whole form of looking at the global economy to look at our transaction has to change. So what's happening in these terms of rising trade protections, geopolitical tensions, and fragmentation? People are looking for more resilience to be introduced in supply chain, do with your friends, your business. So in this sense, how do we reimagine our relationship with the West? Unfortunately, again, there is something called the weaponization of finance. Increasingly, economy is being used to achieve your political and military and strategic gain, instead of the earlier way of looking at trade as an instrument of cooperation. Today, trade is weaponized to exert political and strategic aims. So this weaponization of finance, the fragmentation of the global market, rising geopolitical tension, within this, how do you reimagine? What will be your framework to look at the dynamics is very crucial for us, including the earlier conglomeration like the ASEANs or BIMSTEC. How do they operate with this new trade? We need to have a rethinking process, keeping in mind this larger context. The last issue that I would like to talk is to go back to the first one. We begin and end with that. Is to look at Indo-Myanmar, pick up that India and Manipur. We see this weaponization of finance, geostrategic calculation in economy. Our experience, we tend to forget. We have always been part of this kind of a lens throughout the last 75 years. That Manipur or the Northeast is always looked through a strategic lens. Your trade, your development policies, your economy has never been free from these geostrategic calculations. For the rest of the global discussions today in economic development, international trade, one is using this phrase called geostrategic calculations. My submission is that within this country, our experience or our nature of economic policies and development processes of which we are a participants in some way, largely as the beneficiaries rather than the productive force or the contributor in some sense. We are the buyers, we are the consumers of these economic structures. That places you in a very different position, unlike the Punjabis or the Maharashtrians or other places. Northeast is majorly positioned as a consumer and the beneficiaries. This geostrategic lens, people have written, and I'm just trying to remind ourselves again. NEC, role of governors, and his report on law and order. Why is it been part of deciding your economic policies? When you build roads, it's for the enhancement of not goods and services, but it's rather to facilitate strategic aims, troop movements, faster movement, mobilization of troops, and so on. So I've given you two examples, how NEC operates. Why is that development is always seen through this? But development of infrastructure is how it is always looked through this strategic calculation. That's why I said governance on report, on law and order, influences its policy, your investment. Third issues, your all economic thinking is also rooted through counterinsurgency and the so-called alienation. So your economic policies, even within this experience in the last 75 years, we think that this geostrategic calculation is a new vocabulary or a new lens to look at the global trade and economy. But for us, our own economy has always been within that lens. And that is why and wherefore of our economic status must be understood within that lens. And to when we say India's relationship with Myanmar, I have already talked at the beginning about the locations. When you and I think, it's bound to differ. Because of this, I said trickle-down effect. The major benefit is the truck is going to Delhi. Something trickle down here, that's a benefit of the look-east policy. What is our role? We have been a consumer all throughout. So what is our role? What are our resources? What are our strengths? In this, in policy-making decisions, whether our intellectual economists, how many of them play a significant role in shaping and thinking about these policies? And I must confess here, last 25 years, and I began some sense of this, I can take names. Professor Atul Bora, a very prominent economist from the region, and member of planning commissions. When I got associated with them were some of the Northern scholars and young teachers like me. Wherewith he said, let's think through Northeast, and there I found predominantly Assam is the epicenter of imagining Northeast. And their intellectuals, bureaucrats, are the ones who are majorly influenced. So the Ahomia's way of looking and the rest of the country also cannot be the same. We have similarities, but we need to distinguish. Just as I have reminded you that when we think about even the mountainous regions, Nagaland, Mizoram, and Manipur are different. So I'm not saying that Ahomia and us are completely different. We share the entire burden of being a Northeast, but I'm trying to figure out, you're thinking just as India's way of looking at Northeast strategically was already been set up by their engagement with the Naga nationalist forces. In a similar sense, the economic thinking or otherwise is always through the lens of Assam. And how much of this, when we think about India, India's Northeast and so on, what is that we are going to do here? What is our position? What is that we look at it? So I would like to end within this. A lot of people have been talking about the core issue, the core issue. The core issue is to understand our location, be that trade, global trade, development discourses, or national building project in this country. What is our location? What is the nature of Manipur's position within the Indian Republic? That is the core issue that we must think, including for this violence. What is the relationship between Delhi and Imphal? I'm using it as a synodic, you can understand. Does Imphal have the power, the agency? What is the nature of Imphal's agency? Even to deal with its own problem, be that illegal immigrants, drug problems, armed groups. What is this Manipur as a state? What is its location? What is its nature of its agency? You have seen. That is the core issue. All through I've been saying since beginning, I said location. Our core issue is not only when thinking through economic development, our participation in the nation building project of the country, anything that you think, cultural project, military strategy, what is that location of us. So in short, I only put it, this location we must ask, what is our place in Indian Republic? What is our relationship with Delhi and Imphal? Remember that Delhi and Imphal relationship is not acted through on government to government relationship alone. It could be a national political parties, central and a state unit, All Manipur Football Association, All India Football Federation, Sanjit Nagak Academy, UGC, Manipur University. What is the relationship? It is acted out in various domains. That we need to know when we think about India and our relationship. What is our location in that India? Would you be able to influence the decision-making process? And what is the decision being taken? What interest of yours is being represented in that one? All that I have said is to understand this location. So India, when you imagine for this, my appeal to you is that we have a habit of going in a very rhetorical fashion. You need to understand yourself, Manipur, its history, its uniqueness, based on your own accurate intellectual competence to understand exactly not all your desires and manipulating facts. You need to understand this country far more than your rhetorics. What is this country? What is India? And what is in our positions? That even when you say we as an Indian, then you will understand better what India, that India you're talking about. And when you say we as Manipuris, what is that Manipur you're talking about? I'm just giving you this. It's a critical thing. Otherwise, as I have said at the beginning, in any all social sciences research, if you wanted to have some sense of objective truth, that the investigators on location must be first understood and positioned. This is not only about feminist research method. It is understood now in our social sciences in general. Your location, look at PUCLs. Incidentally, I'll be talking tomorrow about that report here in the university. We call it in social science reflexivity. You should have been able to think, what is my ideological orientation, my assumptions, my biases, my background influence the way I see things. If you have done a little bit of analysis on that, you will see things more objectively. It is in that spirit I am asking. You need to understand India properly and Manipur properly. I've laid out some of the issues in terms of to conclude it. I've said about our locations, exactly the historical shift, and especially in terms of economy, of movement of labor and capital. In the 19th century's turning point, how we become part of the South Asian dynamics more than Southeast Asia, despite the geographical tilt towards and historical experiences, how that shift has happened, and what is that location would mean for us in understanding this relationship. Second, I talk in terms of an immediate context, where I have suggested that you cannot look at India and Myanmar. You need to have a triakic formulation of India, China, and Myanmar. Only then you will be able to see things much more clearly. The third aspect I have already told you is the larger context, how the picture of this 70s, 80s negotiation culminating in 1990s in a globalization, liberalization across the globe. That economic structure has changed globally now. It is more fragmented, and there's a rising geopolitical tension across the world, and then many countries are adopting this, what is called friend-shoring approach, doing business with your own friends and so on, and fragmentation of the global economy. In the light of that, how we reimagine. The last one is, I'm going back to the location again to understand what is Manipur's position in this Indian Republic. For that, you need to understand Manipur itself as well as India. You cannot rely on certain rhetorics, either for or against. You need to have a very positive and objective assessment of these two questions. And I believe that that's the core issues, because many of us have in our mind as if Manipur is a concrete reality, like an independent sovereign country that existed before, in a peculiar imperial world order. That Manipur you are bringing in here today without realizing. I have written this long time back in local newspaper. I call it Manipur is a constitutional fiction to them. You need to understand, but in our mind, we have a very substantive way of thinking about Manipur. Your concrete reality, you need to understand, and all your thinking process must be based on this acceptance and engagement based on this understanding. Otherwise, you will have a very different, I can give you examples where we have been making mistakes because we don't understand these dynamics. So I have in with us the entire thinking related to today's conflict. I have already said how this conflict is also related to that particular dynamics. And my core issue is this question. For everything we think, what is our place in Indian Union? What is the relationship between Delhi and Imphal? Where the Delhi and Imphal relationship determine how you can and you cannot. And then, most importantly, you will know the nature of your agency. Only then, this is my position, this is our position. You will have a clearer picture. Otherwise, we lose track of it. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much, sir, for such an elaborative and insightful speech. I'm sure everyone gets lots of knowledge